Before we start the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. And now, let's go. Story 1. I saw him for when I had woken up in the middle of the night. My dogs were barking at something, but it wasn't normal barking. It was more like the sounds dogs make when they're scared, whimpering and yelping. When I got up, I could hear the dogs backing away from something. I could hear their paws rustling through the dirt, growing more and more desperate. At that moment, I was worried that some kind of animal had gotten inside the fence. I should have known it wasn't an animal. The only dangerous animals out here in the countryside are foxes. But I didn't care. I went outside with a machete. The first thing I see is a man wearing a cloak, a wide-brimmed hat, a short cape, and carrying a staff. He was dirty, with mud stains all over the lower half of his body. I froze, not from fear, but from surprise. I live in the middle of nowhere, out in the countryside where the road to my house is just a dirt path that goes on for kilometers and leads nowhere. It looked like he wanted to pet my dogs. He had his hand stretched out and was walking strangely, using one hand to grab and drag his leg forward while holding onto his staff. All the while, my dogs barked louder and louder. I approached him, gripping the machete tighter with every step. I raised my hand to touch his shoulder. I felt every movement, my finger getting closer, my muscles tensing, my body leaning in. I touched his shoulder. He began to stand up with the help of his staff, digging it into the ground, using his strength to straighten up. And he began to turn around. The second he turned, the dogs bolted back into my house. He was still looking down, and suddenly he laughed. It was a deep laugh like Santa Claus if he'd smoked a pack a day since birth. He stopped laughing slowly, then said, "Forgive me. I saw the dogs from afar and had to see them." He said it in a kind tone. I got a little angry. He was speaking to me like he was strolling through the suburbs and just saw a dog in front of a house. He was in the middle of nowhere. And besides, there's only one way to get here. You have to go off the road completely. So I asked him directly, "Okay, but why are you in this area?" I sounded a bit annoyed. The man sighed and spoke seriously. "I'm on a journey to a place, and I stopped here to see one of God's creatures. Again, I apologize. It wasn't my intention to wake you or scare your dogs." I stared at him confused, and he said, "I'll go now. I can't stop for long. I have a long road ahead." He chuckled softly. He was an old man, and morally, I couldn't just let him walk alone in the night, especially out in the countryside where he clearly must have gotten lost if he ended up near my house. "I'm not going to let you go alone. Let me grab my things, and I'll take you where you want to go in my car." The man, still not revealing his face, looking down and completely still, said, "Accipio." I didn't understand, but he stayed still, so I went inside to grab my things. When I came in, I saw the paw prints had stained the wooden floor, and I could hear the dogs whimpering, howling from my room. I turned on the lights to find and grab my car keys and jacket. I went to my room and saw the dogs hiding under my bed. It felt exaggerated, like when Scooby-Doo sees a monster. The point is, I had never seen them like that. I kept ignoring the signs and grabbed my jacket from the wardrobe, picked up the keys from my nightstand, and went back outside, closing the door behind me. It was starting to get light, like a breath of relief from the tension and unease of the night. The man was still there, waiting for me where I had left him. In the daylight, I could see him more clearly. His hands gripping the staff were gray, wrinkled, looking like the skin could fall off any moment. He was still looking down, but I could make out more of his face. From afar, I saw his mouth hanging open, drooling. I figured because of his age, it might be normal. Maybe he didn't have the strength to keep his mouth closed. I started walking toward him. With every step, he seemed to lose the strength to hold himself up. His body looked like it was falling apart. I began to hurry, feeling the sunlight blinding me. When I finally got close, I was standing in front of him, and he had collapsed. When I tried to lift him, he wouldn't let me, until I grabbed him by the arms, and his hood fell back. It was a rotting corpse, like he had died years ago. I dropped him. Thump! His clothes shifted, revealing more of his body. I could see his chest. There was a huge hole exposing his ribs, and on each rib was written, "Caperteris ignotus iter facit," he who travels through unknown lands. The phrase comes from the old pilgrims who journeyed through foreign lands out of devotion to God. The only thing I can imagine is that his pilgrimage wasn't finished. And if something above is watching, it decided not to let him die until his journey was complete. But why did his journey end at the door of my house? What is this land? What do I have to do with God? Story 2. I've always loved horror stories. When you're a kid, most of the world is so unknowable, it feels mysterious, like anything at all could be possible. You just haven't seen it yet. When you grow up, of course, the magic wears off and the boring reality of closets without monsters and dark rooms with nothing to hide sets in. As 10-year-old obsessed with scary books and campfire stories, I believed in everything and wanted nothing more than to prove their reality. I spent hours walking the trails near my house on dark, foggy days and stayed up long after my parents were asleep in hopes of seeing a flickering light or a couch moving by itself. I was terrified and fascinated all at once, and I was sure there was something out there that only I could discover. My first taste of the supernatural was from a story my best friend Jack told me when we were around 7 or 8. His family had moved house only recently, and one of the reasons, he told me, was because their old one was haunted. One night, he was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when he heard voices coming from down the hallway. He thought nothing of it at first. It was probably his parents, so he turned over and tried to fall asleep. But the longer it went on, the more he listened to them. There was only one voice, female, but it didn't sound like his mother or sister. So he got out of bed, put on his dressing gown, and walked to the door, pressing his ear against it. He could hear the voice louder, but he couldn't tell what it was saying. He opened the door as slowly as he could. Yellow light from the hallway spilled through the widening gap. He stepped out and walked down the hallway and around the corner, but there was no one around. Then he heard the whispers coming from downstairs, but by the time he got to the bottom, they were gone. He stood still on the last step for a few moments, looking out into the dark living room. He couldn't see anyone, and he didn't want to look any further. It doesn't sound very convincing looking back, but it creeped the hell out of me at that age, especially when he told me his parents had heard the voice before. And when they told him the last owner, an old lady, had died in the house, that was all the both of us needed to believe without question. The house was definitely haunted, and that was definitely why they moved out. The other big ghost story at that age was told to us by another friend, a tall red-headed kid called Alex. Alex's story came from his older brother, a 16-year-old who, to us, gave the tale ultimate authority. It was a ritual. He said, you go into a bathroom, run both the taps in the sink, turn out all the lights, and look at yourself in the mirror. Then you close your eyes and say, Bloody Mary, 3 times. When you open your eyes, you see a woman's face in the mirror covered in blood, and then she kills you. This one was pretty silly, especially as I now know it's an urban legend that goes back decades in England. But I'll never forget how scared I felt standing alone in the schoolyard while Jack and a few of the other boys went into the bathroom to try it out. I was so sure I'd never see Jack again. When I was 11, I started my first year of secondary school. That was where I first heard about the monster in the woods. At that age, I was allowed to play browser games on my dad's laptop at the weekends, and when no one was looking, I would scour the web for ghost stories and urban legends. I became hooked and read through probably hundreds of short tales on forums and local myths on forgotten websites. I memorized my favorites and would sit around with my friends at school at lunchtime, telling them as best I could. I wasn't much of a storyteller, but I had a great time trying to scare everyone. All boys at that age seemed to enjoy a scary story, but only 2 loved them as much as me, Jack, and my other best friend at the time, Roger. Roger was tall and confident and was the social butterfly of our trio. While Jack and I were quiet, he was loud and funny and always making new friends. We got on like a house on fire. It was Roger who first told us about the monster. Walking home from school one sunny afternoon, talking and joking, he said, "Do you guys know the Gnawbone?" "What's the Gnawbone?" I asked, immediately serious. "It's a monster in the forest down Landing Lane," he said. "You just made that up," said Jack. "No, Simon told me." "Simon's a liar, Roger," said Jack. "He's just joking with you." "No way," said Roger, shaking his head. He heard about some kids from Drury Road School that went down there a few weeks ago and got chased out by the Gnawbone. "We're not stupid," said Jack. "What did it look like?" I asked. "It was like white all over and had these huge teeth," Roger said. indicating with his hands, and it crawled like a dog and ran after them. "I don't believe it," said Jack. "Why wouldn't the police do something about it?" "Don't be stupid, Jack. The police wouldn't believe them anyway." I said, "We got to go check it out, guys." "Yes, we'll hunt this thing down and kill it," said Roger. "Okay then, but I still think it's a joke," said Jack. "We better be prepared though," I said. "The gnawbone sounds pretty dangerous." "We'll bring some weapons," said Roger. "It'll be no match for us. I'll get my dad's flashlight." "Meet by the landing lane sign tonight then," I said. We ran back home grinning. We were finally going to catch a real-life monster. I could hardly sit still during dinner, and the clock seemed to be going much slower than usual. At last the sun began to set, and I told my parents I was going out to Jack's house for a sleepover. It was the weekend tomorrow, so I knew they wouldn't mind. I stepped out the door with my father's big silver flashlight in one hand and a toy sword tucked inside my belt. It was made of hard, thick wood with a red painted handle, and I thought it would do some serious damage if we got into any danger. I set out for Landing Lane, ready for adventure. When I reached the sign, Jack and Roger were already waiting for me. Jack was holding a ring spanner, and Roger was holding a small plastic gun that fired rubber darts. "The gnawbone's gonna be fucked," said Roger, seeing my sword. "If we can even find it," said Jack. "I was gonna bring the cap gun unmodified," said Roger. "You know, the one that shoots real bullets? But I left it at my cousin's house." "This stuff will be good enough," I said. "Come on, let's go." We started down the path as the sun sunk down over the horizon. Landing Lane went up from a cul-de-sac off the main road and wound down through a series of fields and little country houses. But a short way up it, there was a narrow dirt trail that ran off downhill and along a river that went for miles. We turned down and followed the trail, where it quickly became dense in trees and overgrown grass. "Where did they see the gnawbone?" I asked Roger. "I think it was past the weir," he said, "where the woods are." We crossed the footbridge and came to the fork in the trail. If you turn right, you follow the river across miles of open country. If you turn left, you go past the weir and into the woods. We turned left. "Cliff, turn the flashlight on," Jack said to me. It was getting dark now, and it was hard to see where we were going. I found a rubber button with my thumb, but when I clicked it, nothing happened. "Isn't it working?" said Roger. "Hang on," I said, hitting the top a few times. It came to life and lit up the weir in front of us. I clicked it to the highest setting. "Wow, that's great," said Roger. "We can see anything with this." We trudged along in unison, me sweeping the flashlight and Roger pointing his dart gun ahead with both hands. We followed the trail across the creek and up a dirt hill where the trees leaned together, blocking out almost all of the moonlight. We had been in the woods several minutes when Roger stopped us. "Look over there. I think I see something," he said, pointing through the brush and past the fence. "We're not supposed to leave the trail, Roger," I said. "This is important. We're the only ones with a chance to catch it," he said. I decided he was right, and Jack agreed. So we stepped off the trail and over the rotting fence. We continued walking at a slower pace. The brush was thick, and we had to constantly push through branches and leaves to make progress. We couldn't see much in front of us anymore, as the flashlight only lit up as far as the next tree hanging down in our way. "What did you see up here, Roger?" asked Jack. "I don't know, it just looked interesting," he replied. "Keep going, we'll find something soon." We pressed forward until we came to a clearing with a line of pine trees on one side and the dirt covered in dead autumn leaves. "Hey, check this out," said Jack. He was crouched in the dirt holding a burgundy wool scarf. Roger and I walked over to him. "Monsters don't wear scarves, dummy," said Roger. "No, but someone was out here. How'd they find it when we went off the trail?" said Jack. "Let's keep looking," I said, excitement growing. I walked past the bush we came through and pointed the flashlight out down the row of pine trees. The clearing stretched out farther than I could see. "Hey, I think this is a path, guys," I said. "Awesome. Maybe this is the Gnawbone's den," said Roger. We huddled together and walked along the hidden road. I took the sword out of my belt and brandished it in front of me. Roger pointed the dart gun ahead, and Jack readied the spanner. We crept along looking for signs of a den. Snap! We spun around in unison, pointing our light and weapons in the direction of the sound. It sounded like a twig snapping, but we saw no culprit. "You guys heard that too, right?" said Jack. "Let's go quicker, guys," said Roger. We walked faster, throwing glances over our shoulders, until something big came into the view of the flashlight. It was a house, a big old brick house with 2 stories and a big chimney on the roof. The bricks were cracked behind layers of moss. The roof was missing tiles and half the windows were smashed in. "Whoa, what's that?" I whispered. "This must be where the Gnawbone lives," replied Roger. We walked toward the house and saw no one around. The door was open and there was a faded sign above it. "St. Margaret's Home for the Chronically Insane." "Wow, it's an old asylum," said Jack. "What's an asylum?" asked Roger. "It's where you go if you're crazy," said Jack. "Don't you live in one?" We laughed and shone the flashlight through some of the ground floor windows. We couldn't make out any people or any furniture inside. "Should we go in?" said Roger, suddenly seeming a little less confident than usual. "Okay," I said. Battling the Gnawbone didn't seem so easy now we were here. We crept up the steps and peered through the door. It looked empty. "You go first," said Roger. "No way, you've got a gun," I replied. Roger stepped up to the door frame and put his back against the wall, gun in both hands. He then spun around and strode inside with it pointed in front of him, just like we'd seen cops do in movies. "This room's clear," he whispered. We followed him inside. The room looked like it used to be a reception area with a long wooden desk built into the corner and a stairwell leading up to the next floor. "Let's go upstairs," I said. "It's probably hidden up there." Roger led the way up the stairwell, and we stepped into a large ward lined with rusty metal hospital beds. "This is so creepy, guys," said Roger. I walked along the room, swinging the flashlight across everything. Then I stopped dead, light pointing at the wall. "Guys," I said, "look at this." On the wall was some graffiti written in green spray paint. It said, "I walk the trees night by night. I know each one by name and sight. I find the children all alone and rip and tear and gnaw the bones. What the fuck?" said Roger. "That's so creepy," said Jack. "I wonder who wrote it." "I think we should get out of here," I said. "Yeah, he's probably not here anyways," said Roger. "Gnawbone got off lucky tonight." Jack and I managed to chuckle, and we headed downstairs. We stepped out the door and walked down the way we came. The atmosphere was lighter now. We were heading home, and we laughed and joked as we strode through the leaves. Roger just got to the end of a funny story about his cousin when we heard it. Footsteps. We must have been making quite a lot of noise as we came down, so we didn't notice it at first, but in the silence it was obvious. We all froze in our tracks, and the footsteps stopped a second later. We stood there a moment, too scared to turn around. "Did you guys hear that?" I whispered as quietly as I could. I saw them nod. I motioned for them to keep walking again, hoping desperately that we were mistaken. But we weren't. I heard the footsteps start again with us, trying to keep in rhythm with ours, but not quite succeeding. "Run!" I yelled, and we took off sprinting across the leaves. "Look for the scarf," yelled Jack. That's where we turned off. As we ran, I was sure I heard the footsteps start to run as well. Without turning, I threw my sword behind me as hard as I could, but I didn't hear it hit anything, just the sound as it dropped to the dirt. I saw the scarf up ahead and the hole in the bushes where we came out from. We dived in and began the fight through the greenery. It seemed even more dense and hard to push through now, and I was running low on energy. It was a cold night in autumn, and I wished I had worn my coat. Then I tripped on a tree root and hit the ground. The flashlight fell from my hand and went out. My friends pulled me up and grabbed it, but it wouldn't turn on again, even when I hit it. We had no choice but to push on without light and find our way home. We finally made it back to the trail, covered in scratches and nettle stings. We stopped for a second to catch our breath, but I heard rustling back where we came from, and we sprinted down the trail, hoping we had picked the right direction. I knew we did when I saw the river emerge from the trees in the moonlight. We were almost safe. When we were far enough away from the woods, we went the rest of the way at a quick walk. None of us had heard footsteps in a little while, but we didn't feel much better. After what seemed like an eternity, we were off the trail and back on the paved footpath of Landing Lane. We walked down to the cul-de-sac and under the street lamps, the first light we'd seen for a while. We walked to the main road and set off up the hill to Roger's house for night. We knew his parents wouldn't mind us being out so late as long as we were quiet. As we lay in our blankets piled on Roger's floor, we discussed what had happened on our adventure. It was definitely the Gnawbone following us. We decided and we'd tell everyone at school on Monday. When Monday came around, most of them didn't believe us, of course. We were too well known as horror fans to make any kind of convincing case for our encounter out in the woods, even when Roger showed his scratches to anyone who would look. But it didn't matter to us. We knew what had happened, and were certain we'd had a close encounter with the paranormal. As excited as we were, though, we never went down Landing Lane after dark again. Things went on as normal after that. I was still reading horror stories and still obsessed with proving them to be real. I wrote off the Gnawbone as a confirmed case and moved on to others, though I never got anywhere as close to any of them. As we got older, Roger and his family moved away. We tried to stay in touch, but you know how it goes when you're little. He was a 3-hour car ride away, and to us he might as well have been on the moon. Jack and I never saw him again after we turned 12. Eventually, I left school, got a job, and moved out of town. I still kept in touch with Jack, but I got busy and didn't see him as often as I wanted to. Until one day, at the ripe old age of 24, I got a call from him. Part 2. https://www.com/r/nosleep/comments/1kzu 3rs/within_the_trees_part_2. Story 3. Hey, everyone. I work at a small occult historical collective in Oregon, and we're currently doing a requisition project of stories that could have been lost during the Second World War. Why anyone thought that a group of less than 15 people at the opposite end of the world would be able to effectively log anything from what is at the exact opposite end of the world is lost on me. We managed to get our hands on a couple collections from some history archives overseas that didn't care enough to log it themselves. They've been pretty normal so far, but this one I just found seemed a little off. It might be a translation error, as I know they've passed hand a couple times already, or just some bored French guy wanting to pull our leg, but it seems to mention countries that never existed. Putting this out there in hopes that someone can figure out why the names got so jumbled up. Thank you so much for the help. /Casper content warnings. War, suicide, loss of family members. Letter goes as follow. I offer this letter as a record of events. I hope that in departing this information, I may somehow aid Boudreaux one last time. All I ask in return is that you understand my effort as a soldier simply trying to save his country. I have left this letter and signed to protect the memory of myself as well as my family. I served in the Second Great War in the 1st Infantry Regiment of Bordeaux. I was deployed on the Northeastern Front. To give the horrors of my enlistment any true justice would require too much time. However, I will tell you how it ended. In the latter half of the war, the Bohemian Empire had pushed us through Reims, and the terrible possibility of losing Paris was becoming more plausible. The general had become desperate. His name was Hugo Ardennes. He was old, even for general. His skin was pallid and thin, as if being pulled taut against his salient skeleton. His face was gaunt, tired, and cold, appearing as if his flesh were trying to retreat inside of him for warmth. Even in the regiment's worst states, he would never relinquish himself of his night blue parade uniform. He wore them like vestments, refusing even to remove his hat to show respect for the soldiers he allowed to die. As the war raged on, we found ourselves foot-slogging deeper into our territory. The Bohemians never left us a moment of true respite. Their artillery fired from a distance. I don't think they were firing on us to kill. They hardly hit anyone, but what they did do was break the will of our tired regiment. Soldiers would first go quiet. Not long after, they would shamble their way to the side of the road, stop, and sit down, as if waiting for someone to come pick them up. Trying to convince them to come along was impossible. I probably would have found myself waiting along with them if it wasn't for Alain. We had become close friends during the war. When I first met him, I thought I was gazing into a mirror. His hair was brown like mine, his voice carrying the same cadence and nasally tone as mine did, and his face bearing the same angular features I inherited from my father. The question of paternity was out of the picture as my father died in the First Great War, only months after my conception, and Alain was 2 years younger than I was. He had a family like mine, a daughter and wife waiting for him when he returned from the war. He said his daughter took an interest in the arts, which he took with exasperated acceptance. I never should have taken her to see that play in Paris. As the Bohemian forces carved through our territory, Taking what little land we had left, the general decided to take a stand along the Marne River, just outside of the city limits. The position was impossible to defend. We were given no time to fortify. The mud collapsed in on itself as we struggled to dig through it to muster a defensible position. When Bohemian forces re-entered their effective range, our troops had only managed to harrow the mud into a thin network of trenches. That's when the general began sending groups into no man's land. He would pace through the trenches in a feverish fervor, frantically ranting on how we would not let these barbarians take Paris, that we would stop them in their tracks, and all we had to do was make one last stand. He would rake his bony claws against the back of his pockmarked, scabbed neck, pulling out what thin gray hairs remained as he began making his way through the trenches. He selected the soldiers at random. Some soldiers tried staying quiet. It didn't save them. When some refused, the general would shoot them himself. It went on like this for months. I watched as man after man was marched up the steppe like clockwork. None ever returned. It was only a matter of time before his finger would point towards me, followed by the simple call of "you." He said it so swiftly and calmly, as if assigning teams in a game. I knew my time was coming, but I didn't expect that finger to land on a land next. We were quiet as we waited. It's like we thought the general would forget us if we simply stayed quiet enough. Of course, that would never work, and we were eventually ushered up across the steppe into no man's lands. As I breached the surface, the pale sun scorched down through the low-hanging fog, revealing fields of corpses, blue-skinned and as green as their uniforms. Their flesh oozed through their torn uniforms, heavy with their drink. It dragged them down as if being amalgamated into its unanimous, undivided mass. Some were more visible than others, their torsos still rising above the mud. Others you could only see by their boots or flecks of color in their uniforms. We were barely on our feet when the bird-like whistle of mortar fire grew closer, and the mud around our feet was turned into a treacherous ocean of sludge. We ran and hid, ran and hid, ran and hid. There were 11 of us now. Ran and hid. 9. Ran and hid. 7. Ran and hid. 6. The whistling stopped as a shell had landed right in the middle of our troop. I barely had time to react before my fellow soldiers were sent cascading into the air, falling apart from the force. I awoke to a sharp stabbing pain in my left leg. The pink mist had settled. I was the only survivor. Alan was in the Creator with me, or half of him was. There were men farther from the blast that were killed. Alan was farther from the shell than I was, but he was dead, and all I wasn't. I didn't move after the blast. Not that I could have, so I sat there for 14 hours. 14 hours spent in that crater with Alan. I thought of the men in the mud and whether I was going to become one. There were countless men lying on the surface, but as I lay there, I could feel the thousands more lying in wait, slumbering deep within the murk below, unable to move from the weight above them. Their crying voices now clogged in the dirt, their bleeding nails that once clawed through the mud now motionless. They were safe in the artillery, which still boomed overhead. I watched the soil take Alan, dragging him deeper into its earthy, sodden maw. Our parliament would surrender that morning. The men laid down their weapons and tore the flags from their jackets. Bohemian soldiers made their way into their newly acquired Paris, and Hugo Arden would take his life with the very same revolver he used on his men. I would spend a brief period in a Bohemian military hospital. I survived the blood loss, but I lost my leg to the following infection. After a month, I was sent back to my family in Montbard. My town was one of the regions offered to the Bohemians in trade for peace. The town was empty now, aside from a few who shambled through the streets as they were pulled through life with the guide of habit. I returned to my wife, daughter, and mother. I returned home. The shelling of the war had left most of the town leveled, yet there it stood. The resonating thunder of artillery has turned its pipes into an ever-seeping mass of lead. My leg had made finding a job challenging. We had to rely on my wife's inheritance. I began work as a collector of sorts. I would collect shipments of guns and gear found in the now abandoned war zones. I try and fix them, then send them back to whatever buyer I could find. I dealt with a lot of veterans myself who found an odd comfort in the rifles which defended them during the war. However, My biggest customer was my new empire. It didn't bring in much money. My daughter was entering school, and my mother's condition, which left her wheelchair-bound, was worsening. It was a year into my new career when I found it. It was brought to me in a shipment from one of the contractors I commonly dealt with. The shipment was ordinary, containing rusted swords of dead officers and mud-caked rifles fished from the rolling hills of the east, but amongst this shipment was a Modely 1892 revolver. It was rusty and still bore the dry blood stains of its previous owner. The chamber only spun in one direction, forwards. At the end of the cylinder was a singular expelled round that would not budge no matter how hard I pried. Despite its condition, it was apparent to me that this revolver was a beauty in its prime, and that it was a real tragedy it had fallen into such a sullen state. There was one trait of it that seemed to still be visible through the muck and rust, an engraving at the base of the handle. It read HG. At that moment, I knew who the revolver belonged to. I understand that countless men bear the same initials as my late general, but I can assure you that that revolver belonged to him, and that it was the same one he used to take his life those 2 years ago. Upon this revelation, a deep terror resounded within my bones and spread inside me. I immediately threw the revolver in a case and put it in the back of my workshop. The rest of the night would go as normal, sorting through the remaining equipment and deeming which ones would be worth repairing and what I would need to do so. The next morning, when I made my way down the stairs in my workshop, I was overcome by a need to confirm what I saw the previous night. I approached the small box with caution. My shaky hands managed to open the box and reaffirmed my previous judgment. Not only that, but the round still confined in its chamber had been reloaded. The rusty casing was not pried from its resting place. A new shining round wasn't jammed through that crevice. It was the same bullet, but cleaned, and I, of course, could not see anything past the primer, but I knew it was loaded now, primed and ready. Despite my years of service, the nature of a firearm, a weapon in its purest form, has never failed to frighten me. Spears have their use for fishing, axes are used for chopping, and even swords which hold the same purpose as firearms at least bear some resemblance to familiar knives, but firearms are different. Their only purpose is to destroy another creature with as much efficiency and range as possible. There's a feeling you get while holding a gun, a feeling that it is yours. You've elevated beyond the chains of your weakness. As I cradled the revolver in my palm, I felt no such feeling. I understood that if some adversary were to wrest it from my hands, that it would have no problem cocking back its hammer, swinging forwards, lighting the fuse, and dispatching the broiling iron proboscis that would shortly cleave through my skull, plunging my electric thoughts into the inky void of the afterlife. It was very matter-of-fact, my thoughts. I didn't fear it especially, for it did not desire for me to be killed, nor did it desire the death of any others. Still, in my pajamas, I ventured out into the backyard. The cold morning dew soaked in my socks, the light cloth growing muddled. I pressed onwards, observing the Royal Navy sky shrouded with pockmarked clouds, choking out the teal light of the morning. Once I had reached the epicenter of the court, I raised the revolver from my side, training its sights into the mud. I hoped that maybe firing the round would dislodge it, and by doing so I could start with its rehabilitation. I looked down its sights, fixating on the small cup of mud where the bullet would land. I pulled the trigger in an amphitheater of hollow homes. The shot rang out. I inspected the chamber once more. I tried allowing gravity to pull the round down into the mud by my feet, and yet it did not budge. With no intention of burning my already shaking hands, I brought the revolver inside. I had only spent a couple fruitless hours of tinkering with the lodged round before I heard a wailing from upstairs. I heaved myself off my chair and clambered up the stairs with great effort. When I reached the top, I saw my wife and what used to be my mother. My wife stared at me with pleading, bloodshot eyes, as if asking me what to do, as if there was anything I could do. No man, no matter how acquainted they are with death, can do anything in that situation. I told my wife to run to the coroner. I waited with my mother until he arrived. It was the coroner's verdict that she had been trying to reach for a safe she had been keeping up on a shelf. She had kept it safe for hard times. She tried reaching it with her cane, but as she stretched her arm thin, trying to pull it off the shelf from her chair, It came down on her with crushing force. It fell onto the intersections between her jaw and her temporal. It dislocated her jaw and fractured the base of her cervical bone. After the impact, she slid backwards in her chair before being stopped by the wooden support beam in the middle of the room. Staring up at an unnatural angle, her jaw opened wide in agony. She would watch as the leaking pipes above would drip down into her mouth until she drowned. The sound of the safe crashing must have been muffled to the rest of us by the gunshot. I stared at her, her skin a familiar pallid teal. The coroner carried her out, and with my leg, all I could do was watch. We would bury her the same day. We collected the money from a safe. Its door was still dented from the impact. It lasted us a couple weeks. The following days were a blur. We couldn't tell our daughter the reality of the situation, so we told her she had passed calmly in her sleep and that she had been taken kindly into Letharian's embrace. I tried to maintain normalcy, but every now and then I would hear a click, sometimes deep in the night, other times while eating dinner with my family. On the third day, I checked on the revolver once more. The round was back. I threw it in a rage. I tried dismantling it, smashing it, and melting it, but nothing worked. The more I seemed to fight against it, the faster its unrelenting march towards travesty would become. On the seventh day, I took it to the woods. It had reached the live rounds chamber, and I did not want to know if I would take my wife or my daughter first. I didn't know if it would kill me or not. It didn't the first time. I considered that it might be based on age or proximity, meaning that maybe this time it would choose me. I wondered what my family would do without me. I pushed the thought aside. It wouldn't matter if this thing killed them first. I fired the revolver into the woods, and that day I managed to delude myself into thinking that I was able to stop it from killing anyone, or maybe that the entire thing was a coincidence. The next morning they found the remains of the Auguste boy. He had stepped on a landmine that had been left over from the war. Naturally, it was only an estimation, yet it seemed to have happened at the exact same time as the gunshot. I felt some guilt following the incident, but it was better him than my daughter. After confirming my suspicions, I entered a routine. Once every week or week and a half, once time's march had round its way through each empty chamber, I would venture to some fringe of the city and pull the trigger. One of my most frequented locations was Cimarron-Auxois. After the war, the city was deemed habitable enough by Bohemian civilizations. To them, the town served as a bastion of the might of their all-powerful empire, and they were there to revel in their spoils. For them, it was easy enough to ignore the crimson engravings in their floorboards and the festering shallow mounds outside the city. I would frequent the city when I could. I'd charter myself a carriage to make commutes more convenient. I had connections in the city, but that wasn't really why I was there. After my first few visits, I started to like it. There was something powerful in it. Sometimes I like to think that Revolver was having some anomalous effect on my psyche, but I don't know if I entirely believe that. My trips grew more frequent as the weeks turned into months. I started firing it multiple times a journey, smiling at whatever fate befell those invaders. When I was lucky, it would choose a soldier, and I would claim their belongings. It became my new purpose. It satisfied me, for the first time since the war, that I felt that my actions had meaning. This weapon could be used for so much destruction. I had to become its keeper. This burden had to be mine to bear. At some point, I had become the only one spinning its chamber. There was a day marking the 1-year anniversary of winning the war. The Bohemians planned on holding a parade in Cimarron-Auxois to honor their victory. I intended to be there. I left my house in a rush. My wife tried to stop me. God, I should have listened to her, but the time of the parade was nearing, and I had to be ready when the parade would start. I didn't tell her where I intended to go. I arrived in the city with nothing but myself, my wallet, and the suitcase carrying the revolver. I rented a room in a hotel overlooking the river promenade. Peering out the window, I watched as the soldiers moved like ants, assembling their belching iron arms with mindless precision. I almost pulled the trigger right then and there, but I held back. When the time came, I would collapse their hollow-hearted exhibit of heroism. All would see their true nature as benign cannon fodder. The sun circled the sky, bleaching the houses white and furrowing the brows of the audience which gathered along the sidewalks. The parade had started. I pulled the revolver from my suitcase and spun the chamber before it locked into place with a decisive, metallic snap. I watched as a young man lifted his rifle to the sky, ready to fire the blank which would bring the faceless men to march. I pulled the trigger with him. I saw the bayonet rifle come loose from his hands as he fired. He stumbled forward to catch the runaway rifle. It wasn't long before he reacquired it by driving the bayonet through his throat. Before the Bohemians could react, I spun the chamber and fired again. The crowd began to panic. I saw a man get expunged by the mass and thrown into the street. The machinery continued its inexorable march as the man's screams were silenced by rolling treads. I spun and fired and spun and fired until the iron burned in my hands and the chamber screeched against its hinges. I watched as one of their howitzers went off, cleaving through the horde. The screams were inaudible over the firing of artillery. I can only assume they were snuffed out quickly enough. I didn't let it stop me. I felt the revolver spasm in my hand, but I kept firing and firing and firing. It was therapeutic to feel like I had power over it. I only stopped when I saw them. They were nestled among the crowd. My wife and daughter were there. They shouldn't have been, but they were. I tried stopping the revolver, but the act had already been committed. I had set in motion, and it was going to collect its dues. My hands burned as I clawed at the cylinder. It snapped back into place, taking my ring finger with it. A howitzer groaned as its wheels dragged the long barrel through the crowd. I screamed at them to run, to duck, to do anything, but they couldn't hear me at the heart of the maelstrom. The howitzer passed over them groaning as it came to a stop. I prayed that the coughing machine had already exhausted its load. The revolver convulsed as two cracks filled the air. I watched as the roiling metal caught fire and erupted mere feet away from them. They were nothing. I left after that. They never caught me, the Bohemian officials. How could they? There was no evidence I did anything wrong. There was a time I considered turning myself in, for not much more reason than to see an end to it all. Call me a coward, but I could never bring myself to do it, whether it be out of fear or a strange sense of obligation to keep the revolver safe. If the wrong person were to find it, the consequences could be catastrophic, so for my country, I will be its keeper. I booked a train to Prague. Nothing is keeping me here anymore, and I fear that my duty is far from over. If you have anyone located in Prague, be wary. I intend on killing as many of them as I can before they figure out how to stop me. Story 4. The summer Texas air hung heavy and thick, clinging to everything like a wet blanket, even as the evening sun dipped low. My name is Oliver, and for me, it was just another shift at Schlitterbahn Water Park. My new maintenance tech gig was a decent step up from pulling all-nighters at Waffle House, even if it meant wrestling with chlorine levels and clearing out gross drains. But tonight's task was different. Tonight, I had to dive to the bottom of the maw. This wasn't just any water slide. The maw was the park's newest, biggest, and without a doubt, its most unique attraction. It was a giant slide, but the real showstopper was at the very end. The park owner, Sterling, a dude with more money than sense and a famously macabre taste, had bought it. It was a shark statue, dredged from the cold, murky depths of some forgotten lake. According to Reddit, the statue was a prop from a low-budget horror flick, sunk by its creators to startle unsuspecting divers after production wrapped. I'd seen the pictures online, the ones that popped up if you dare to search for abandoned lake shark statue. They were unsettling, sure, but more fascinating than frightening to me. Just a big, weird piece of art. A quick warning. If you have even the slightest bit of submechanophobia, don't look them up. This massive great white, its head frozen in a bizarre, vague smile that looked almost unintentional, a subtle, upward curl at the corners of its mouth that just seemed off. But to me it looked cool as hell in the pictures. Sterling had spent a fortune retrieving it, then even more having it mechanized. Now for just a few extra bucks, after a screaming descent through twisting, dark tubes, riders were spat into a vast, deep pool where the shark, its mouth agape in that almost menacing smile, loomed directly beneath the surface, occasionally lunging upward towards the guests with a hydraulic hiss along a 20-foot track that made the whole pool rumble before the machines pulled it back, making it descend out of sight to the deepest area of the pool, waiting for the next round of unsuspecting victims to trigger the sensor. Tonight, after the last shrieking kid had been ushered out and the gates locked tight, the mall was silent. Not just quiet, but a profound, almost oppressive stillness that felt strangely peaceful. I ran through my checklist, filters, pressure gauges, and then the shark itself. The most critical sensor was acting up, meaning I had to get in the pool and check its housing. I grabbed my dive gear, feeling a pleasant calm. Just another Tuesday night. I strapped on my dive mask, adjusted the regulator, the hiss of my own breath a steady, comforting rhythm in my ears. The pool water, usually a chaotic riot of splashing, was perfectly still, reflecting the distant park lights like scattered diamonds. I pushed off the edge, sinking smoothly into the cool, chlorinated embrace. The world above vanished in a ripple, leaving me suspended in a dim, watery silence. As I descended, the surface light gradually dimmed, the familiar blue-green deepening to an inky black. I flicked on my dive light, the beam cutting a crisp, clear path through the gloom. And then there it was, the shark itself. I'd seen it 100 times from the surface, as well as the photos online, but being eye level with it underwater was different. It was huge, dwarfing me, but still just a statue. Its cold, unseeing eyes, twin black voids, didn't bother me. But that smile, so odd, that faint, almost evil-like curl at the corners of its mouth. I figured it was just how the mold settled, a trick of the artist's hand. It seemed to expand slightly in the low light, but that was just the water, the lack of real vision. A mild curiosity and nothing more. At least that's what I told myself. I forced myself to focus, kicking slowly, deliberately, toward the shark's head. The faulty sensor was located near its jawline. The water directly around the shark was surprisingly clear, almost unnaturally so, as if the massive form repelled the usual murk, granting me an unobstructed view. As I drew closer, the details sharpened. The rough, pocked texture of its fiberglass skin, somehow organic despite its artificiality. The perfectly formed teeth, each one a predatory shard. And that smile, the one that just didn't quite sit right, seemed to deepen. Not wider, not more aggressive, just deeper. A subtle crinkle around its mouth that hadn't been there before. I paused, treading water. Must be the angle, or maybe a trick of my dive light bouncing off the contours. I took a steadying breath, the sound loud and calm in my ears. Just a statue. I murmured the words a garbled bubble. Just fiberglass and hydraulics. I forced my fingers back to the panel, finding the latch. I finally got it open, revealing a tangle of wires. I quickly checked the connections, nudging a loose one back into place. Done. I started to close the panel, already thinking about getting out and grabbing a cold bottle of sweet tea. Just as my fingers brushed the panel to close it, I glanced up. The shark's head seemed to have shifted a fraction, the subtle tilt to the left a bit more pronounced. And the smile? It had deepened, just a hair more, a hint of something sly, almost knowing in its fixed grin. A prickle of unease finally touched my calm, an uninvited chill under my wet suit. I blinked, shaking my head. Currents. Gotta be the currents. I pushed off the statue, kicking backward. I felt a deep but very brief vibration that seemed to emanate from around the statue itself. My heart gave a little thump, a nervous flutter. Okay, that was weird. The hydraulics were offline. The park was deserted. I was the only one here. Must have shifted slightly with the water currents, or maybe I'd bumped it. I needed to get this done. I needed to check the track itself, where the shark slid. That would mean swimming past it, to its flank, towards where the tail would be. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, that strange, unsettling feeling growing, but I pushed it down. It was silly to be spooked by a hunk of fiberglass and paint. With a deep breath, I swam past the shark's massive, immobile head, past its still body, until I was almost at the tail end of the mechanism, my back to the sharks in its entirety. I worked quickly, checking the rollers on the submerged track, my light beam dancing over the metal, the familiar routine a welcome distraction from the rising unease. As I pulled my gloved hand back to adjust my light, a sudden, sharp click echoed through the water. It was loud, like metallic and unsettling, almost like teeth clinking together. It was too close. My breath hitched, a sudden, involuntary spasm. The sound was too precise, too deliberate to have been an accident. My mind screamed at me to spin around, to see, but my body was suddenly paralyzed, muscles locked, refusing to obey. The silence that followed the click was even worse, a heavy, expectant quiet that seemed to hum around me. Every nerve ending in my body screamed wrong, wrong, wrong. I steadied my light, my fingers fumbling, and as I started to attempt to calm myself, a sudden, oppressive cold radiated from behind me, making the terror that was in my blood run even deeper with each passing second. It wasn't the water. It was a presence, a chilling weight, a suffocating awareness that filled the space directly behind me. Slowly, reluctantly, as my whole body screaming in protest, my head swiveled and my entire body froze in its tracks. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare in horror at the sight before me. The shark. It was no longer facing forward, its head merely tilted. No, no, no. It hadn't even just tilted further, a gradual nor a deliberate lean into my personal space. Its entire body was turned completely on its axis, now facing me head on. Its nose was now only a mere 5 feet away from the protective glass of my mask. Its mouth, already agape, seemed to widen. A slow, silent stretch of its impossibly broad jaw that swallowed more of the dim light from my beam. The grin was not just vague, deep, or sly anymore. It was a monstrous, impossible rictus of pure, menacing evil. It stretched impossibly wide, pulling back, until its lips seemed to tear, revealing every single one of its impossibly white, jagged teeth, each one a perfect, ancient blade. Its eyes, those dead, black, unseeing eyes, were now ablaze with a malevolent, hungry glee, reflecting my own terrified, distorted face in their depth. It was still immobile as it always had been, still as night, but its expression showed a sliver of hidden mortality that shook me to my core. It wasn't just watching me. It was savoring my terror, a silent, yet deafening laugh in its fixed, demonic smile, a cruel amusement in its paralyzing gaze. It was alive, and it was playing with me. Oh, F-U-C-K. I didn't bother with my tools. I kicked with desperate, frantic, soul-shattering force, propelled by pure, primal terror through the water. The silent grin of the maw, its eyes lit up with sinister delight, burned itself into my mind, its own special brand of terror. I clawed my way upwards, kicking and thrashing, desperate to break the surface, to escape the crushing darkness. My lungs burned, screaming for air, the dim outlines of the surface lights shimmering tantalizingly above. I was halfway there, a choked sob bubbling from my throat, when I couldn't help myself. I took one last, terrified, agonizing look back. The track was there, but the fucking shark was gone. Nothing but the wavering reflection of the park lights and the silent, swirling chlorine. No, 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 no. I thrashed and kicked furiously towards the lights that swore me my safety, my eyes playing tricks on me. Every bubbly wave from my erratic movements that momentarily obstructed the few inches of clear vision I had was a fin and a flash of a gigantic tooth. The surface seemed a million miles away, the fear that I would be pulled back down to bottom of the darkness the second before I finally reached the safety of the dock weighing me down. But I scrambled out of the pool, tearing off my mask, my breath coming in ragged, painful, heaving sobs that racked my whole body. I stumbled backward, away from the wooded edge, my gaze fixed on the water, watching it slowly settle, the placid surface a cruel lie. I knew it wasn't empty. That fucking thing was still there, somewhere. And I knew, with a horrifying, absolute certainty that stole my breath, that it had just let me go. For now. That was my last night at Schlitterbahn. I put in my 2 weeks the very next morning, no explanation given, just a flat I'm done. Sterling called me multiple times, begged me to reconsider, even offered a bonus. Oliver, please. I'm not sure what happened, but we can fix this. Just tell me what you want. Give me a number, man. I'll match it. But I just hung up. I couldn't set foot in that place again, especially not near that pool. The thought of that black fucking abyss beneath the water of that pool was enough to make me gag. As it would turn out, the park closed down for good a few months later. The official line was unforeseen operational difficulties, but everyone knew it was just code for we can't tell you why, but it's bad. A few days later, Sterling just dropped off the face of the earth, and no one has seen or heard from him in a year. They never mentioned the shark in any capacity. It was never spoken of again, almost like they had done their due diligence to erase the fact that it even existed. I don't know what happened to it, if it was ever moved again, or if it just stayed there, along with the rest of the park, abandoned and waiting in the depths of the now disgustingly unkempt water. I hope to God no one ever finds it. Not in that pool, not in any lake ever again. Maybe lost forever. But, unfortunately for me, it doesn't matter if it's hidden from the rest of the world. I see it every night. That grin, those eyes just before it vanished. It's always there, waiting in the darkest corners of my dreams, bubbling beneath the surface of my consciousness. And now, I can't even look at a swimming pool without feeling that cold dread, that lurking, predatory presence all around me. Watching me. Open water? Forget about it. The world suddenly feels too deep and too full of things that watch you from the dark. Things that hunt you. Things that smile. Edit. Holy shit, a breaking story on the news tonight immediately caught my attention while I was eating dinner. A group of parents are desperately pleading for anyone who can give them information on the potential whereabouts of their missing children. 3 teens have been missing since last night. They were last seen by a homeless man hopping the fence of a local abandoned water park. https://www.reddit.com/r/nosleep/s/and 5dytu3ru. That's it for today's creepy Reddit tales. Before we go, I just want to say a quick thanks to all of you for watching, liking, and sticking around. You guys keep this channel going, and I'll be back soon with more stories that'll make your skin crawl. Drop a comment if you've got your own spooky tale to share, and I'll see you in the next one.